Hi, everyone. If we could all take our seats, we're going to get started in just a minute. So I'll just give you all around 30 more seconds to get seated. Welcome to the EPIIC Symposium, and welcome to this panel, Defining Refugees in a Changing Climate. Thank you all for being here, and I want to also take a minute to recognize President of Tufts University, Tony Monaco, for being here, so thank you. My name is Gabe Haddad. I'm a senior studying international relations and Chinese here at Tufts, and it's been an honor to be a member of this year's EPIIC Colloquium on Migration in a Turbulent World. And I'll be the moderator for the panel this afternoon. We brought this panel together to discuss one of the more subtle and complex issues within the space of migration: how to differentiate and define the varying circumstances that compel people to leave their countries in search of a better life. Whether it be persecution, lack of economic opportunity, impending climate disasters, or something far more specific, people migrate for many different reasons and have individual and unique needs based on their situation, ranging from asylum status to work visas, from food to shelter. The status quo of the migration system today permits the sacrifice of human rights for the sake of arbitrary national policies. In this age of globalization, goods and commodities seamlessly pass through borders, and yet the people who this industrial system is meant to serve remain blocked by these borders as incidental victims of a flawed system. The UN set clear definitions for asylum seekers and refugees at the Refugee Convention in 1951, and it provides guidelines for ensuring that their needs are met and that their human rights are protected. And yet, these guidelines are not perfect, and millions suffer as a result of its shortcomings. As our globe changes both physically and politically, we have to ask ourselves if there are holes in this safety net that need to be addressed. Experts are predicting today that tens of millions of people are vulnerable to climate-related events in the coming decades, such as rising sea levels and intensifying weather patterns like hurricanes. Those in countries like Bangladesh, where the bulk of inhabited land is at sea level, are extremely vulnerable to increased water levels and may soon have to leave and find new homes. Climate change is poised to create a colossal migration crisis, and so we must address some critical questions today about our system before it is confronted with these new challenges that it may not be equipped to handle. Can our current system cope with a surge in migratory flows across the world? How should we define those affected by natural events? And is climate refugee even a suitable label for the coming situation? But climate refugees are not the only people challenging the 1951 definition of a refugee. Where does one fit whose assets have lost all their value because of inflation and instability, and who has no choice but to leave in a country such as Venezuela? Are they a refugee, an economic migrant? Where do we draw the line that decides who is allocated a certain amount of international assistance? Evidently, the existing framework for categorization is limited. There is a demonstrated need to reshape our perceptions of the different scenarios that push people away from home. And during today's discussion with these fantastic four panelists, hopefully we can take a step in the right direction. So before I introduce our panelists, I want to briefly explain how the panel will run. Each panelist has been asked to speak for 10 minutes, and I'll introduce each of them before their speech. This will be followed by an opportunity for the panelists to ask each other questions, and then we will open it up to the audience for more questions. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Mr. Harden Lang. Harden Lang is Vice President for Programs and Policy at Refugees International, an independent humanitarian organization that advocates for support of displaced and stateless people. He has extensive field experience and is a veteran of 6 UN peacekeeping missions in locations ranging from Afghanistan to West Africa, and he is an expert on Middle Eastern conflicts and policy. So with that, I welcome Harden Lang.
Gabe, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. Look out, it's a great audience. Thank you all very much for giving us your time. I've listened to a couple of the panels so far. It's a lot of very interesting material that's being covered, and I hope we can build on some of the issues that we've talked about today already, moving forward in this panel. I also want to say happy International Women's Day. For me, my wife runs a large global international women's leadership organization. So when I said I was going to be in Boston today, I got a little bit of the side eye But then I explained that I was going to be at Tufts, and she is an alma mater here. And then the next question wasn't, why are you going? It's, why didn't I get invited? So, and I want to thank especially Professor Williams. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk. We were colleagues at the United Nations before, and I love what you've done with the panel today. I'm going to start by giving a couple of framing remarks about the larger question that Gabe raised with respect to not just climate, issues of people who've been displaced by climate, but questions of the vulnerable who are outside the traditional definition of the Refugee Convention, and how we think about organizing ourselves as the international community to provide a degree of protection and support and assistance to those. Because this is not the first time this issue has come up. Climate is not the first time it's been discussed. And there have been a real effort over the last couple of years to try to reshape and reorganize the international system to begin to come to grips with this. And we should talk about the lessons from that a bit before we start talking about recommendations and the way forward. So, again, we talked a little bit about the 1951 protocol. Let's just put these numbers in a frame. Today, roughly, depending on how you count, there's about 260 million migrants worldwide. Then there are about 25 million refugees and 3 million asylum seekers. In other words, folks who are looking to become refugees or seeking asylum but have yet to have their status granted. So we're talking about, in terms of traditionally defined vulnerables, roughly a little 1/10 of those who have migrated. What's interesting, increasingly over time, is that the way in which these people are moving is that you don't just have a refugee crisis on this continent and a migrant flow on this continent. They're moving together. And it's as they move together in these what are called mixed flows that real moments of vulnerability are being opened up and experienced. And also it becomes much more difficult to begin to sort through these individuals as they come up to borders and to seek asylum or to apply for access in terms of their stories. What motivated them? Why did they move? Is it political? Is it economic? These things blend together. And really, you have to look no further than a crisis which is on the front page of all of our newspapers these days, and which Gabe actually mentioned, and that's the one in Venezuela. You know, there are 3 million Venezuelans in the last 3 or 4 years who have left their country due to a variety of reasons. If you interview them in the countries they fled to, and they fled to, if I could put a map up on the wall, you would see Venezuela, and then you would see 10 countries in Latin America and in the Caribbean where they have moved to. The vast majority right now, not majority, but the plurality are in Colombia, but they're also spread across different countries in the Caribbean, Peru, Ecuador. And what's striking about this, I mean, I think many of us would look at this situation from the outside and go, these people are naturally considered to be refugees because of the political situation that a number of them are fleeing. However, very few of them actually have that status in the countries that they've gone to. And quite often, when you interview them in these countries, they won't identify as people who are fleeing persecution. They're saying, we're looking for a better job, or we're looking for access to services or health care. You then probe a little bit farther, and you find out the reason why they're looking for access to health care is because they were associated with a political movement in their country, and they can no longer get access to health care in their own country. But what's happened as a result of the fact that they're not refugees is that the treatment that they get, and by and large, Latin America has been tremendously welcoming of these people. You have, in Colombia, for example, over 1 million people, Venezuelans who are there, and in a country where there are already 7 million IDPs, and so they've been deeply welcoming of them. But they have different statuses and different accesses to relief, or access to relief. So, for example, in Colombia, you have hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans who do have access to the labor market through these temporary permits. So it's not a formal refugee process, but they have access to certain forms of temporary rights and relief. But then if you pivot to the Caribbean, you know, which doesn't sound like an awful place to be if you're fleeing Venezuela, but if you're in Trinidad or in Tobago or you're in Curacao, many of those, you know, the tens of thousands of Venezuelans who are there are living underground, in essence, because they have no rights to act, they have no access to rights, no access to the job market, no access to health care. They can, if they're picked up or they're found, they are put in detention and quite often sent back to Venezuela. For many of them, what amounts to refoulement. So this question of how we define a refugee and how we look for vulnerability and understand vulnerability inside of these populations is actually really very much at the front line of a crisis that's also not just for humanitarians, but for many in the national security business, a big focus of interest here in the United States. As we think about access to assistance, right, and what does it mean for these vulnerable populations to have, who are not traditionally defined as refugees, how do we think about expanding the opportunity for them to have access to rights as refugees? What would that mean? It's important to look at what has been attempted over the last couple of years. In 2016, the world was galvanized around the Syrian refugee crisis and the crisis in the Mediterranean. And this was primarily led by, hundreds of thousands of Syrians moving very quickly from the region into Europe through a series of different pathways, both the Balkans and then up through from Turkey into Greece. But this was combined with large flows of economic migrants, or traditionally, but also some refugees, moving up from Africa through Libya and onwards. Again, this led to a political moment where you had members of the nations of the world coming together at the United Nations and basically asking the question, is the humanitarian system still fit for purpose? What are we able to respond to the kind of global crisis that we're seeing in a way that has any hope of meeting the needs, and also having any question of addressing like international stability? And the basic response was not really. So what we had in 2016 was something called the New York Declaration, where the countries came together and basically committed themselves to a line of action in which they would try to wrestle with this question of being fit for purpose. And there were a couple of key issues that they thought they were going to get to grips with. One, they acknowledged for the first time that there were multiple drivers of forced movements that needed to be addressed and required relief. Second, there was a tremendous need to uphold the rights of people on the move regardless of status, and that's particularly important for our conversation today. And third, the New York Declaration promised to take on the failure of governments to cooperate to ensure the movement of people was more safe, orderly, and regular in a way that it hadn't been until now. So the New York Declaration then provided this foundation for what became two processes that we talked about in the last panel. One was the development of a global compact on migration, and a second on a global compact on refugees. The global compact on refugees, that negotiation process, which went on for about 18 months, was led by UNHCR with consultations with a number of member states from all over the world. But it happened largely inside the confines of the terms of the 1951 Convention and the 67 Protocol. And as we'll see, for very understandable reasons, because there were many who, on the outside who grumbled about that, but many on the inside who said, look, what we're trying to do here is to protect, we're afraid to open up the convention to a wider conversation in the sense that we're going to backslide. Pivot to the Global Compact on Migration. What's fascinating here is, as I think Kathleen noted in the last panel, there is no, up until that point, there had been no global agreement, no international document of this nature that basically defined the concept of how migration should be managed. So this was a first, and it was led by nation states, by member states, and it allowed them to do all kinds of things that may not have been possible inside of the kind of negotiations and consultations that were held around the Global Compact on Refugees. So at the end of this, you have these two documents, which in a way, the fact that you even had two processes to begin with and two separate documents means that the fundamental question of vulnerables who maybe fall between the definition of migrants and refugees is very difficult conceptually to even begin to get your head around. So in a way, it may have been better if it had been a single process, but really sort of the politics of international relations dictated that that wasn't the case. So organizations like mine sort of sat on the outside of this process and then participated in some of the negotiations and sort of pushed quite hard, right, for increased rights for refugees and increased rights for vulnerable migrants. And at the end, we grumbled along with a couple of other organizations about where we landed. But I think it's really important to recognize why that is the case. Like, why did we end up where we did before we start looking forward? And a lot of that has to do with, if you look at the situation in 2016, where countries came together for the Global Compact, for the New York Declaration, you had a lot of political will at very senior levels of big important governments to make change. By the time you get to fast forward to 2018, this is no longer the case, or at least it's debatable. Let's take one example. Member states in the EU were a prime driver behind trying to pull together the New York Declaration. What's fascinating to see is now, and if you look at how they have managed over the last couple of years, the situation of these mixed flows, these migrants who are vulnerable, in very vulnerable situations, moving up through what's called the Central Mediterranean route, in through Libya quite often, and then up into Italy. The primary policy hasn't been one about how to manage access into the EU. It's been building a Libyan Coast Guard that's able to basically police the waters off of Libya and to take migrants and refugees back to Libya who are trying to make their way into the EU because EU vessels can't do this. If you're an EU vessel, if you're a vessel from an EU country and you pick up these people, you are bound to give them the opportunity under the European Convention on Human Rights, the opportunity to plead for asylum or to try to access asylum. By focusing on building a Libyan Coast Guard, the intent was control access so they don't even have the opportunity to come forward and do that. So if that's the shift in the mindset of where those member states are, combine that also with, I don't have to go into a tremendous amount of detail about what's happening in the United States. Under the current, it doesn't require a lot of deep policy analysis to come to the view that the current administration in the White House where we were in 2016 is not what their priorities are moving forward for migrants and refugees. You have only to look at the Muslim ban. You could look at the separation of children and families at the border. You can look at this new policy on return to Mexico, where individuals who are coming up to the Mexican border, to the U.S.-Mexico border, they can apply for asylum, but then they have to go back to Mexico to wait to hear whether or not their case can be adjudicated, which means they don't have access to lawyers from the United States, which raises very serious protection concerns, and I suspect will be the subject of an injunction quite soon. So all that said, you have that happening. At the same time, you have overall funding for humanitarian endeavors and for refugee relief going down to a certain degree, and opportunities for resettlement for refugees also beginning to fall off. So at a global level, when this sort of thing happens, when there's not leadership from the traditional humanitarian leaders, you're going to get yourself into a very difficult moment of having high expectations for intergovernmental processes to produce new documents that are going to solve the problem. All that said, some stuff has happened in the last year or two, which is quite interesting and which provides a jumping off point for having a conversation about what we can do, even inside this political environment, to try to improve access to protection and assistance for people who are vulnerable outside of the traditional refugee frame. And one of those lies in the Global Compact on Migration. While there are no formal obligations under the convention or under the compact, there are opportunities within the language where nation states commit to look at opportunities for expanding the definition of who is vulnerable to include those who have been displaced by climate and other issues that fall outside the traditional refugee convention. And that opens up a question for national or bilateral initiatives in certain countries, New Zealand and others, which I think we'll get into and explore. Another opportunity, to my mind, occurs that if you look at the fact that you've got a global compact on migration, which was roughly shepherded through by UNHCR, and a separate one that the process was not organized by the International Organization of Migration in the way that UNHCR organized the other compact, but it did play a role. And so you now have these two compacts and two UN bodies, which in essence sort of continue to shepherd these processes forward, who may be able to find a way to work together. For example, looking at some kind of cross-platform foundation or organization or mechanism that would allow for the two organizations to begin to collaborate more closely when looking at people who are sort of falling through the cracks. And by this I mean, again, people who are vulnerable, who don't fit into the traditional definition of refugees, but who may fall under certain opportunities for action under the Global Compact for Migration. And finally, there are actually examples of where IOM and UNHCR, the two bodies that deal with these two populations, are beginning to collaborate more closely. And here I would look at Venezuela again. The Secretary General went forward and appointed a gentleman named Eduardo Stein to be a joint envoy to oversee the efforts of IOM and UNHCR as they respond together to the crisis in Venezuela across the region. And I think that kind of platform, where you've got both IOM and HCR working quite closely together, provides, at the operational level, the ability to begin, or at least an opportunity to begin to do this kind of work on the ground that can provide protection to those who are in those kind of vulnerable situations which don't traditionally fit under the refugee definition. And so with that, I will pass the mic. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Mr. Michel Bomani. Michel Bomani is Vice President and Counsel at State Street, a Boston-based financial firm. He was born in the Democratic Republic of the Congo before moving to the U.S., where he is trained as a lawyer and has extensive experience in business law, both in the private sector, at law firms, and in the public sector at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. He is also a passionate immigration advocate, and his commentary has been widely published and distributed. So with that, we welcome Michel Bomani.
First and foremost, I hate this thing being in front of me. Can anybody hear me? First and foremost, I want to thank this team panelists. I'm very, very humbled to be speaking among you all, but I also want to thank all the Tufts students. I think you've done a wonderful job choosing a very pertinent topic, but also just put together an amazing panel. So, and a very important conversation to have today. So, as Gabe said, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to start with a disclaimer. As a non-academic, I don't study immigration, and I don't study climate, but I am an immigrant and a refugee myself. So it's an experience that I live that I can speak about. My comments today are not academic in nature, but they're personal, based on the work that I've done with many people and the conversation I've had with other immigrants and refugees. Being an immigrant and refugee is an experience that has defined me. It's not one that I chose, but it's one that chose me. So today, I'll speak to you from a personal perspective. I focused our talk today on the defining piece of defining a refugee. When I will talk about climate and the different climates change that are happening, in my opinion, it's more so of a mental climate change and a perception as to what being a refugee is. Also, I figured that I would speak to future leaders, because in this room, we have people who are currently capable of improving the system and people who will soon be able to change the system. But more importantly, all of us are human. And with each refugee or immigrant, try to be human and listen to their experience and their story. Help them in any way you can, but also teach and learn from one another. You'll hear me use immigrant and refugee interminably. I don't think the two terms are the same whatsoever, but in my case, I am both. If you turn on the TV today or read a newspaper on your phone, because I don't think anyone reads newspapers anymore, the term refugee or immigrant has a negative connotation. However, immigration is absolutely nothing new. It's something that's happened for centuries. It is a basis of formation of countries, including the United States. And it's something that's studied by many people, as exemplified by the people in this room. And many of those studies have shown that immigration and refugee is good. It's good for diversity, but it's also good for the long term of the hosting country. Despite all of this, there's still the perception, and a negative perception nowadays, of when you hear the word immigration or refugee. Now, yesterday, Dr. Jacobson talked about, and also we heard from Mr. Lang today, about how there's 25 million refugees, but not all of them are living in refugee camps. And I think from Sir Paul Collier, we heard that many of them go to the neighboring countries. They're not coming to the United States or going to Scandinavia. They're going to countries, I think we said Turkey and Africa and the Middle East. However, the question that I want to pose, and hopefully elicit a discussion, is despite the fact that they're living in capitals, what conditions are those people living in? It may not be a refugee camp, but what are those conditions? Are they fully employed? Are they healthy? Are they able to attain high levels of education? Is it a good life? So let me focus my comments today on what happens, in my opinion, on the mind of the refugees as they go through the process. It's not a process that changes, it's a process that evolves over time. So the first and foremost, you have to leave your home place, your place of birth. It's never truly a choice. Most of the time, it's the very last resort. So as a result, you aren't fully prepared for this economically or mentally. You may not have enough money to live. You may not have settled your affairs in your home countries. You may not have your birth certificates, your diplomas, proof of where you've lived and what you've done your whole life. Forget about making sure you've stored away any money if you have any. Many times the process of moving is just wherever they'll take you, that's acceptable enough. You don't do research. Now just think about it for a second. Your analysis as to where you will go that will change the rest of your life is just based on where they'll take you. And it may be all you do. And then one day, through various processes, refugee camps, or you just go to the next country, you arrive in a host country. Now, as I said, to me, this is a personal experience, so I will speak about the United States because that's what I know best. If you're lucky enough, you speak the language when you arrive to this country, but we'll table that for later. But you begin asking yourself questions. Who am I? Do I belong here? What did I do to deserve my life being so upended? While at the same time being incredibly thankful that you have a new life, which is hopefully safer. But then now what? You might have spent the days, if not decades of your life, just fighting to be alive and safe. And now you have to think about jobs, families, housing, healthcare. Now the US has pretty good programs of all sorts to help arriving refugees. But you have to start navigating it all. School enrollment, taxes, bank accounts, bills. You have a whole new life in a whole new country, a whole new culture, and a whole new community. And you start asking yourself, how am I going to make it through all this? Was this the right choice? Your search for identity might also mean that you have to try to be as American as possible, which may mean for you, sound as American as possible, be as American as possible, whatever that means to you, and try to assimilate so that maybe, just maybe, others, and probably or yourself, you can begin thinking yourself as an American and saying, I belong here. At some point, maybe 3 years, maybe decades, you may start feeling like you belong, or maybe you definitely don't. But in either way, your Americanness or your non-Americanness self becomes more solidified. You get in a groove and a rhythm, a cadence, and being an American starts making sense. Your English starts to improve, and you have what I call full duality, where you feel both American and other. In my case, African. Not African-American, both American and African. You begin carrying out your life, and finally things begin to make sense, and you start having a better sense of self. But then there are days where there's always the sad feeling that you always be others. Because whenever you hear an anti-immigrant sentiment, you hear comments about race, comments about accents, most of the time all negatives. You realize that you'll always be an immigrant. And that being an American for you may always be just as far as carrying a passport. It may never be your true identity. Now, with all of that, the full duality also kicks in because you start becoming more and more proud of your past country, your country of origin. You begin proudly saying where you were born and raised. I was born in Democratic Republic of Congo. I don't dismissively say or say quietly or just say Central Africa anymore. Now, I want to close my observations today to sort of talk about the generalization that happens when you think about immigrants and refugees. We talk about it as if it's this homogeneous group that's all gone through some sort of experiment and we can put them in a bucket. But it's very different. I'm black, I'm African, and I'm a man. My experience when I hear the word ICE is very different than a friend of mine who's Hispanic and also a refugee. However, when I walk down the street and I see a police officer with a gun, as an African, as a black person in America, my experience is different. So my experience as a refugee, a black African refugee, is very different than a Hispanic refugee or hopefully Venezuelan, if we define them that way, refugee. Now, the footnote about language, I want to talk about three big things, in my opinion, that change, big changing point in the life of a refugee or an immigrant when they come to America. One is language. Language proficiency. Most of what I do is actually with English and helping English people who are immigrant English, because I believe the moment you have language proficiency, you start getting a sense of belonging. Your voice starts mattering, and you can fully participate in the country's economic, but also civic duties. The second piece is citizenship. It's finally a time in your life when someone wants you. You have a home, you have a land, you belong somewhere. And for Americans, as far as procedurally, when you come as a refugee, when you finally become a citizen, you can finally travel again. You have the ability to leave without getting a visa or having to explain why did you go, and certainly why did you go back to the country you fled from. It also opened up jobs, having a citizenship, because now you can apply for federal jobs. You can do anything you want, because you're pretty much just as American as anyone else, except you can't be a US president. I'm not sure anyone wants to do that job anyway. So. And finally, education. The ability to have an education in America gives you an American education. That sounds repetitive, but an American education may be undervalued by most Americans. Because as a refugee, having an American education opens up doors in America, but also you can finally take this education to maybe travel around the world and have an American education, and the value that's placed upon that is insurmountable. So I'm hoping to elicit some conversation more than anything else, and I look forward to hearing everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Dr. Nina Hall. Nina is a professor of international relations at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Bologna, Italy. She is originally from New Zealand and is an expert on international refugee governance and the climate's influence on global affairs. She's the author of Displacement, Development, and Climate Change, International Organizations Moving Beyond Their Mandates. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm really impressed with how well you've organized this conference, and so thank you very much for having me. And I'm also going to speak mostly about my academic work, but refer a little bit to my own personal journey. I am, as you mentioned briefly, a migrant, not a refugee, and thanks for the points that you made as well about the categories, because we will come back to that. I've spent most of my adult life living in Europe, in the UK, in Germany, and Italy, so in countries where I don't speak the language fluently. But what I want to talk about more specifically is really about how do we categorize people who are displaced in the context of climate change. So these aren't experiences that I've had personally. And I wanted to start just by positioning ourselves. I've put New Zealand and the Pacific at the center of this map, mostly because that's, it's where I'm from, but also because a lot of the discussions around climate change and displacement have focused on the Pacific and Pacific Islands. And for around 20 years now, there's been a discussion, at least in New Zealand, about whether and how New Zealand should be assisting Pacific Islanders with the impacts of climate change. This is one Pacific Island. Have any of you ever been to any Pacific Island countries? Just interested. Yeah, I've got a few. What places have you been? Just interested. New Zealand? Oh, great. Anywhere else? Sorry? Indonesia, I heard Polynesia, Marshall Islands, right. Anyone been to Tuvalu, Kiribati? No. So these are the two countries that are most talked about in the context of climate change and displacement, because they're low-lying atolls. This is Kiribati here, with often no more than 5 meters above sea level. And they're really seen as the canaries in the coal mine. So what do I mean by that? They're the countries that are potentially the worst affected by climate change, because as sea levels rise, which we know is already happening, there's an increased frequency of king tides, but something that's often not acknowledged, apart from floods and high tides, is that salt water is intruding into the groundwater. So what that means is you no longer have fresh water to drink, and it also means that agriculture becomes increasingly difficult, and in fact some of these atoll island countries have had to import drinking water in recent years. Recently, the Fijian Prime Minister Frank Bainimarama stated that Fijian farmers are watching their crops perish in soil that has been spoiled by the heightened salinity that is associated with sea level rise. And so there has been a sort of conversation about what do we do as these countries become increasingly difficult to live in. It's likely they'll be inhabitable before they go under. Often the narrative is they're going to drown and then everyone's going to be sort of left swimming. And in fact, even in Al Gore's movie, some of you may have seen it, Inconvenient Truth, most people in the room, 2006, he talks about climate refugees, right, from Kiribati, and he says New Zealand's hosting them, which was actually incorrect. New Zealand was not accepting people from Kiribati as climate refugees at that time, and to this point, no country or no person has been recognised as a climate refugee, which I'll get onto. And so this, in a way, this context of being from the Pacific and being very aware of Pacific Island countries' experiences was where I started my doctoral research. And I went to the UK, to Oxford, where I started writing this book, which my discussion will be based on today. And I was really curious about, well, how does the international community, how do international organisations like IOM, which we'll hear about, or Refugees International, deal with these problems of people being displaced in the context of climate change? And so my book examined how the International Organization for Migration and the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which were established, we've got to remember, after World War II, when the context for what a refugee was very specific, and it was only a refugee was somebody who was essentially politically persecuted in Europe. So there was also a geographic limitation on that. And I wanted to know, well, what are they doing? Are these organizations changing? And to address this issue, I think there's three fundamental questions that I'm going to tackle briefly. One, is climate change actually triggering new forms of displacement? It's an assumption that we often make, and geographers have examined it. Two, how well equipped are our existing institutions for protecting people if they are being displaced? And three, one thing that is less discussed, what do actually the people in the countries affected want? Do they want a new refugee category? And my basic question is this. First, my basic argument is it's unlikely we're going to have any new binding international treaty for climate migrants or refugees. And two, this isn't a top priority for Pacific Island states. Perhaps partly because they don't want to be categorized as refugees, so it's partly about the language. So moving on to this first question, is climate change causing new forms of migration and displacement? Well, it's without a doubt that climate change certainly is impacting, as I've already outlined, people's lives. But I think it's very important that you can't be deterministic that climate change will necessarily force everyone to flee. The estimates that have often cited of 200 million climate refugees are often very problematic as they don't give agency to the people and recognise the very diverse realities that they live in. So firstly, something you might be familiar with is this image is from Hurricane Katrina. And it's to prove the point that not everyone that is in a natural disaster moves. And in fact, often the most vulnerable are those that stay behind, that don't have the social capital to move. And we can remember back to Hurricane Katrina, it was mostly African Americans and working class people who couldn't get out of New Orleans. Secondly, those that do move in the context of a natural disaster are most likely to be internally displaced, not across a border. So a lot of the debates around climate change displacement are how do we create a new category of refugees, i.e. somebody that has moved across an international border, but the vast majority of people when they're affected by natural disasters are actually staying within their country. And thirdly, in most cases where people do end up fleeing across an international border, it's due to a number of intersecting reasons. So I spent time in my research in Dadaab and in Kakuma, two refugee camps in northern Kenya, and certainly there were a number of refugees there who reported they had problems with farming or with drought, but they were also facing persecution. And so there's often a complex intersection between who is facing, who has to move, and it's compounded by political decisions as well. Now the reason I lay this out is because I think it's very important if we start to talk about the need for a new category. If we want a climate refugee convention or a treaty, it's really important to think about how are we going to define those people and who are the most vulnerable and what do those vulnerable people actually want, those people who are affected. Because otherwise we may inadvertently end up marginalising others, so people who are affected by an earthquake, but they don't count because it's not a climate change issue. So in that context, just briefly, I want to take us back even a bit further in time in 2016, because we heard about how the international community has, in the last 2 years through the compact process, thought about expanding notions of vulnerable peoples. But even before that, in my research, I looked at how Antonio Guterres, in his role as the High Commissioner, he's now UN Secretary General, but previous to that, he was High Commissioner, looked to expand the Refugee Convention quite specifically. Now, just to remind us, a refugee under the 1951 Refugee Convention is somebody with a well-founded fear of persecution based for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, and is outside his country of nationality or is unable, owing to such fear, to avail himself of the protection of that country. Now, I read that out in full to give us the sense that this is a very specific definition, right? And that's what UNHCR officials are doing when they're interviewing refugees, is to check that they meet that criteria. So you're not officially a refugee if you're displaced in the context of climate change. Now, this has led to this so-called gap, and others are also in this, as we've already heard, other vulnerable people who might be fleeing Venezuela or Zimbabwe when the economy crashed. And the High Commissioner, already back in 2011, was trying to create a more expansive UNHCR, one that dealt with displaced peoples, not just refugees. And in November 2011, he noted that more and more people are being forced to flee due to reasons that are not covered by the 1951 Refugee Convention. And he argued that it was a humanitarian imperative to assist those displaced by climate change or other natural disasters, and recommended that the international community, and I quote here, formulate and adopt a set of principles specifically designed to reinforce the protection of and find solutions for people who have been forced to leave their own country and may not qualify for refugee status. So what's he saying? He's saying there's a gap, and we need the international community to fill it. So exactly what we heard from the first speaker from Harden. And he pushed states in 2011, so this is in the Obama era when there was more hope in migration and refugee governance internationally, to pledge. He said states pledged to address this gap. And in 2011, there was a major ministerial meeting in Geneva. And unfortunately, only 5 states indicated any desire to address this gap. They were Argentina, Norway, Germany, Mexico, and Switzerland. Everyone else said no. We have no interest. Now remember, this is 2011. This is well before the current rise of populism, anti-immigration sentiment, the huge protests against the Global Compact for Migration that happened around the world. And so if even then we couldn't get states signing up to commit, to think, they weren't actually committing to anything specific at this point, they were just, let's think about how we might address these gaps. It's going to be hard work to do it now. Now, I just wanted to signal, and maybe we can come back to this in Q&A, that there have been some developments since 2011 in global migration governance and refugees. There have been spaces that have acknowledged we need to think about and plan for migrations in the context of climate change. There's the Nansen Agenda, which is on the far left, now called the Platform on Disaster Displacement, that was set up by Switzerland and Norway. 2 of the countries who had pledged that they wanted to do more on migration governance. And that agenda has looked for ways in the international architecture and international negotiations to push the issue around climate change and migration, to say this is something we need to think about and develop some best practice guidelines. And then within the UNFCCC and the climate change negotiations, we've seen a task force being created on displacement. And at Katowice, that was included in the final agreement out of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, that they would continue work around this task force on climate change and displacement. And then thirdly, we've already heard about the Global Compact for Migration, which was signed by many states, not all, the US being one of many countries that decided they did not want to sign up to it, which has noted the need to develop plans and data and coordinate on climate change-related displacement. So we have this discussion and this language is ongoing, but these aren't an effort to create a new international treaty. So there's people talking about this issue internationally, but there's no will, as I see it, to create anything new. Now to finish up, I just want to take us back to the Pacific. Because I think often the conversation ends at the point that I just ended, which is, okay, let's survey what's happening internationally, but what are actually people from countries that are affected want? And I'm going to speak to the Pacific because it's the context I know best. And since the early 2000s, Pacific Island countries have been campaigning really hard, and they have three priorities. One, climate mitigation. Pacific Island states all want developed countries to cut their emissions sharply. They've been arguing for years, well before it was enshrined in the Paris Treaty, that the world should have a global average temperature should be kept within 1.5 degrees. That has always been their goal. In January this year, the Fijian Prime Minister Scott Morrison urged the Australian Prime Minister to shift away from fossil fuels. He said, from where we are sitting, this is the Fijian Prime Minister, we cannot imagine how the interests of any single industry, i.e. the coal industry, can be placed above the welfare of Pacific peoples and vulnerable people in the world over. This was just this week. At the beginning of the week, I saw this on the Tuvaluan Prime Minister slammed Kevin Rudd, a former Australian Prime Minister, not the current, who had proposed, this was his own proposal, it wasn't an Australian government proposal, to offer citizenship to Tuvaluans in exchange for Australian control over fisheries and resources. And he said, look, I don't want this form of neocolonialism. We want to stay in our countries. It's Australia that should cut its carbon emissions. So they want countries to cut carbon emissions. Secondly, they want to stay at home. They want to adapt. And the Niue Declaration, signed in 2008, states this very clearly. The Niue Declaration states that Pacific Island countries recognizing the importance of retaining Pacific's social and cultural identity and the desire of Pacific peoples to continue to live in their own countries. They don't want to move. And thirdly, and finally, if there is a context when they have to move, they don't want to be refugees. They want to migrate with dignity. And these are the words of Anouk Tong, the former Kiribati president. He's very strong on this language. They want to have agency. And in fact, what's interesting, just to finish up here, is that when a new government came to power in New Zealand with James Shaw, who's the Minister for Climate Change and head of the Green Party, he initially pledged to create a new humanitarian visa for climate change. It was going to be the first visa ever for climate change displaced peoples. Now, in the last year, I met him soon after this announcement, as well as various other New Zealand officials. He came back. He hasn't announced officially that he's no longer going to go through with the visa. However, the priorities have changed very significantly. The priorities are aligned with Pacific Islanders, and that's to say, we want to help them to stay, so we're going to do everything we can in New Zealand to mitigate climate change and to give financing to help Pacific Island countries adapt. So I'll finish on that note. Thanks.
Our final speaker is Miriam Troi. She's an associate expert in migration, the environment, and climate change program, which is within the International Organization of Migration. She's done amazing work in policy, research, development, and management while at the IOM, and has authored multiple pieces and legal reviews on refugees and the environment. So we welcome her to speak now.
So thank you, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. I've been going to quite a few universities lately. I was in Montreal last week. I did a few talks with some universities in New York. And I think what we are seeing in the past few years is such a strong interest from people like you who want to know more about the topic and who want to do something about it. And it's here we're mostly talking about the diplomatic dimensions, which is also what I will touch upon. But listening to Michelle, I really thought about some discussions I had with students in social work who are really thinking about what does it mean to be a climate migrant / refugees when you move to the United States and you do have to face these questions of jobs, housing, education, and so on. Another conclusion is that if you are moving because of climate change, you might have totally different needs in terms of your daily life and community than if you're moving because of another factor. So anyway, I think it's good to remember why we are doing this work at the global political level, which is to exactly be able to maybe influence positively the life of people like you, Michelle, but who will be moving because of climate and environmental factors. So having said that, I think everyone here has made excellent points, and I don't want to, I'll try to not repeat some of it, so I'm going to change a little bit what I was planning to say. But on the question, I think what came to me very strongly in what you both said is the difficulty of defining who is a climate migrant / refugees. I mean, you talked mostly about the displacement, so people who are vulnerable, who are falling through the cracks. They are very obviously in vulnerable situations. It's kind of obvious, but what about all of those who seem to be moving for economic reasons? Let's say all the people who will move from a coast towards a city because they cannot fish anymore. We have a lot less compassion for these people because we're thinking, oh, they're just looking for better opportunities. But then if you really try to understand why they are moving, very often it's because they simply cannot stay where they are and their livelihoods are affected by climate impacts. So because of all of these different ways of looking at who is a climate migrant, it's really difficult to categorize indeed who would be deserving of international protection. I mean, in my view, like Nina, I don't think this is going to happen. I'm not sure it's even desirable because it would be really complicated to decide who is deserving, who deserves protection, who doesn't deserve it, and so on. And also politically speaking, I just simply don't see it happening even. I mean, you all mentioned the current context, which is not exactly positive in terms of welcoming migrants. But even in past years, I'm not sure this would have been also something that would be realistic. But it's not sad in my view, because I think there are other ways to really think about these questions of protection and helping people moving in the context of climate change. So both of my co-panelists mentioned the Global Compact on Migration, and Nina mentioned the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So these two these two policy discussions at the global level are very important, not just because it's important because we are not really thinking, I mean, because it's obviously important, but it's mostly because when I first started this job in 2013, honestly, I don't think anyone was really interested in that topic. So I was going to the climate change conference. The first one I went to was in Lima, and we had to fight so much as IOM to even get a little bit of a slot to talk about these questions. In the end, we had about 15 minutes. We were allocated 15 minutes in a side event to discuss climate change and migration. And then as years passed, a lot of media interest, a lot of academic interest, I think more research, people who are influential also bringing this to be and advocating in favor of looking at these questions. So we do see a big shift, and that coincides with what you're saying. We hit 2016, and all of a sudden, in this New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, there is an agreement that climate change is a driver of migration and something needs to be done about it. So it might seem like it's a very small step forward, but for people who have been working on this kind of global policy development, it was a big thing because we went from a moment where it was really hard to get any state interested in this question to a moment where there is an agreement that something needs to be done about it. So I think if you look at both the climate change policy discussions and the migration policy discussions, you will see that they are parallel to one another, but somehow they also more and more intersecting. And I think this is a very important and positive development because before you had people working on migration, just working on migration, they had no connection at all with climate change policymakers, the one who are working on their national adaptation planning in their country, the one who are actually trying to put measures that would reduce greenhouse gas emission. And vice versa, you had all of these people working at the very technical level on climate change, but not really thinking about the social dimensions. What does it actually mean for people to be in a place where climate impacts are so strong that, that their main solution is to migrate? So that's another positive development. I think in the last 2 years, we're seeing more and more interactions between these communities of practice. Also, it's not just at the global level, but at the national level, you do have, in some countries, some kind of working groups between different ministries who are trying to think about these questions and develop some national migration policies, for instance, that will include climate change dimensions, or vice versa. You would have people who are developing climate change national plans who will be talking to their migration counterparts to try to understand how they can link both things. So to me, that's a very positive development. But just maybe to just jump a little bit more into the details of what happened in both the UNFCCC, so the climate change negotiations, and the migration negotiations. I just want to highlight two things, simply because I think they are very relevant to this question of categorization and protection. So you're looking here at two separate processes, couple of years, member states led. Eventually, a document comes out. On the one hand, you have recommendations from parties of the UNFCCC on what can be done to prevent displacement linked to climate change. On the other hand, you have a global compact. As it's been said before, it's a global document, but it does have a very specific paragraph on climate change and environment. So, but in both of these instruments, to me, I see very important things for the future and maybe things that you guys need to think about. So both of the documents acknowledge that there will be some cases where people will not be able to go back home, despite all best efforts of trying to step up climate change adaptation or trying to respond and step up mitigation efforts. So I think for the first time we're saying that, okay, we do agree that at some point some people will need some kind of something, whatever that something is, to be able to, because they won't be able to stay. So what does that mean in practice? That means you need to think about visas, visa options, maybe sponsorship options, labor migration scheme, or relocation of people. So these are very concrete things which can be very scary in the current context, because I don't know if in a country like here, I'm wondering what the discussion would look like if you are, if you're saying, okay, there's this whole bunch of people in some countries in South America, they cannot stay where they are, so how can we think about bringing them over here? So I don't know if we are really ready for this kind of discussions, but I think the languages in both of these policy instruments kind of open the doors to think more about that. And I think the second thing I see here is the question of relocation, which is basically also within a country. So far, we have some examples of all communities being relocated from, let's say, a coastline towards the inland. But as far as I know, this has not really been thought about internationally. And I think that's another question that will really come up, because we have to remember that the Global Compact is about international migration. And in this compact, it says that we need to think about relocation. So logically speaking, it means that we need to think about relocation of people across borders. So these are very, I would say, unpleasant discussions that will come up. I've been kind of involved in this diplomatic scene for the last 4 years, and I've not really seen any countries having the courage, the political courage, to really put these questions on the table. But I think at some point it will just be unavoidable, and that's where I think they will need help to really understand how you can balance the necessity of supporting people who have no other choice with the political reality in which we are now, and also international commitments such as the one outlined in the Global Compact. So to me, that's I think the questions for the future, and where maybe you guys could have a role to play if you're writing your thesis or thinking about PhDs. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I want to give the panelists the opportunity to ask each other any questions if they have any. No? Okay, so with that, we'll hand over the questions to the audience. So if you could just please line up behind the microphone in the middle, and then try to keep your questions brief so that we can move them along.
Good afternoon. My name is Madeline Barrett, and I'm a cadet at VMI. My question for you is based around kind of the continuity and homogeneity of the discussions that we've seen today, including this one. We're getting a very consistent narrative, which is very nice and respectful, and I appreciate that. But I was wondering if you guys disagree at all with points of one another. I know you're all in very different areas and specific expertise in this topic, but I was just wondering if we could maybe get like two sides of one of those issues that perhaps you don't agree with.
I can have a go at this. I don't know enough about others' views, but I think one tension in the debate that I've seen more generally around refugee governance and migration governance is how much to focus on international forum versus regional or national or more local. And some people would say you've got to do a bit of everything, right? But maybe a good way of examining this has been the Global Compact on Migration, which we talked about in relatively neutral tones and relatively positively, right? It's a good thing that we have states coming together to come and find ways to protect vulnerable migrants and try and create safe and orderly migration is a good thing from, I would say, most of us on the panel. But there would be others who would disagree very strongly with that. And I think that that's something really important to recall, that we had significant protests. I was in Berlin at the time, and there were hundreds on the street saying, we don't want the UN to be regulating migration. Even New Zealand, my own country, which hasn't had the same anti-immigrant, anti-populism, there were people who were saying in our centre-right party, the National Party, we shouldn't be signing this compact. The UN should not be running our migration policy. Now, that was partly, from my perspective, based on false information. It was states coming together to decide how to run their migration policy. And the compact, as has been acknowledged, did not set out any clear, or rather any hard law. It didn't force countries to do anything. But the point that I'm getting to is there was an extremely divisive and politicized debate. And you're right, on this panel, maybe we have some similar views. I don't know, I can't speak for my other panelists, that the compact is generally a good thing. There are some weaknesses in it. There are some things that could be improved. But a lot of people outside of this room, and maybe in this room, I don't know, would have had different thoughts.
I mean, I think generally speaking, because we are also working in an environment which is very political, for us that seems positive, because it's really hard to get anything done at the UN. It's really much more difficult than when it sounds. I mean, to get even to these pieces of paper, you're talking about years of negotiations, open and behind the scenes. So I guess by the time these things are done, we're just kind of relieved that something is there. But I mean, joking aside, it is an important political step forward, but I mean, at the moment, it's only blah, blah. So that's where we also need to be careful, because it's one good thing that this thing exists, but this should just be the very first step. So where maybe where not everything is rosy is what do we do with these documents? And at the moment, it's good to have political will to draft a document, but you also need to have it when it comes to funding action and putting the necessary resources to support the migrants and the countries. So that's why I think where we'll see, where not everything will be, I say, we won't all agree on whether it's a good thing or not.
Yeah, sure. Gabe, I mean, I think the other thing that you're going to get a lot of debate about is how do we translate any of this stuff into actual change on the ground, right? How do practical things get done? They're going to make the difference in the lives of the people who are being affected by this. So, for example, if we're deciding that, or if what we're hearing is that, in terms of international politics right now, really hard to get a new definition of refugee, A. B, technically, it actually might be really, really difficult to define that in terms of climate in terms of a climate refugee, right? How do you measure that? And then how does someone, if you're crossing a border and UNHCR is interviewing you to try to figure out what does that mean, how do you judge that, right? What are the benchmarks you're going to come up for doing that? So I think we have a lot of sort of normative commitments to doing the right things, but we're not necessarily getting into the tough conversation about how does that get done operationally on the ground. And then the third part is, we talk a lot about how, the politics in this country and the European Union and elsewhere has changed to make this a harder conversation. But frankly, we have to come to grips with what that means, right? And what is a pathway potentially out of it, or what are the very legitimate concerns inside of some of those politics that need to be addressed? Now, that's slightly beyond the ambit of this panel, but it doesn't do a lot of good to have conversations about how we wish the world were a certain way when this politics reflects deeper concerns that need to be addressed by political leadership, and that simply being in opposition to that isn't necessarily useful if you don't have pragmatic solutions.
Just one quick thing to add to that. We talk about the political element to it, but I think there's a moral element to it. Why should we care, right? Why should the United States care if Venezuela is having a crisis? And I think we live in a different world than we did 20 years ago. it does affect us, being economically, being strategically, being safety-wise, right? And we have ample examples of that, what's going on in Iraq, Afghanistan. When people go other places, things happen. There's a security element, there's a political element, there's an economic element, and that's why we should care. Politicians may or may not understand that, but I think it's sometimes difficult to make the people understand that.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much for this presentation. My name is Rocio Maciel. I'm a first-year student at the Fletcher School, and my question is for Dr. Hall. You mentioned that you don't think, the question of if climate change can be considered itself like a driving force of refugees or migration. And so that made me think, if it's not a direct cause, if people don't want to leave, can it be linked? Can it be a connection between climate change and other causes for migration, for refugees? For instance, drought. Is there a drought or a flooding, and that then creates problems, and then that creates persecution or something. So if it's not a cause per se on itself, if there is a connection, and if that it can potentially cause other causes for refugees.
Great. Thanks for that question. I know it can be a little confusing getting one's head around causality, particularly in the social sciences, and there are people who spend their lives trying to theorize causality. So there is a debate about this, and there are some people, like the World Bank recently published a report called Groundswell, which looks at the number of climate migrants and would assert and put out very confidently estimates of hundreds of millions. And so there is some people who would like to draw for policymakers some quite crisp conclusions and saying, we have climate change, there's 100 million people, this is a hypothetical example, I don't know the exact numbers, living on the delta in Bangladesh. The deltas are going to be flooded, those 100 million are likely to be affected, equals they are migrants, and therefore we can create these estimates. So at a very basic level, one could say, yeah, we can create estimates of people called climate migrants. The problem that a lot of geographers see with that, and migration scholars quite specifically, is what I tried to outline, that people have agency, so people might adapt living on the delta in Bangladesh, and Miriam, I'm sure, can talk a lot more to this as well with her work, or they might not just be affected by climate change, but also political decisions. So often, the wealthier people don't get flooded because they can move, or rather they have the resources to build on higher ground, and other people move. So one of the key, I guess, questions is about how do we understand that relationship? And there definitely is a relationship. I'm not asserting that there isn't any impact of climate change. It's more that it can be indirect, or a threat multiplier is a terminology that's often used. And you'll see in the language that the platform for disaster displacement uses, they talk about climate change in the migration in the context of climate change to avoid that exact problem around causality. So it is a bit of a can of worms of social sciences and how do we understand causality. So the short answer is yes, droughts, yes, natural disasters can affect, but it's not a clear, linear, causal thing.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the presentation. My name is Luca. I'm a third-year law undergraduate student from University of São Paulo in Brazil. And I will direct my question to Mr. Bomani, since he's a lawyer, but you all feel free to answer and comment as you wish. So we have a recent and emblematic case of a Peruvian farmer that proposed a lawsuit against a big German energy company on a local court of Germany because the climate changes destroyed his farm and half of his city, forcing him and his family to move. And until now, this whole migration relations was presented as a three-part relation with the migrant or refugee, the host state, and the living state. But in these cases of climate-changing refugees, can this relation be extended to add these polluters that maybe are causing these climate changes, and how can we responsibilize these agents, being public or private?
It's a good question, and I'll also defer to my colleagues who are probably very familiar with what it is you're talking about. But the one item that I think, again, going back to what Mr. Lang said, is sort of what can we do on the ground. I think one thing we have to be careful about when we start categorizing things is the impact of that, right? And I don't know the specifics of the case here, but I think with climate change, one thing, presuming you can show causality and sort of a direct link, you have to be careful as to what does that mean on the ground on a day-to-day basis. Because I think as of today, we're still grappling with how do you deal with refugees and Violence Against Women Acts, which going back and forth, whether or not it's going to be we're still grappling with what we have as categorization right now. So the one thing that I will say before I defer is we have to be careful about what the impact of that definition is, right? It's not necessarily about the host country, the migrant, and the country that they're leaving, but it's more so what then? How do we deal with the climate change and who takes them and what circumstances and what are we doing to make that better? Because if you have people moving from different places of the world, it's the same world. It doesn't matter whether or not you put a border there. It doesn't matter if there's water. It's going to come. So how are we doing to change climate more so than dealing with categorization?
Sorry, I don't know the case very well, but one thing I can just add is that in the UNFCCC, so in the climate change negotiations, there is a part for loss and damages. And the idea is essentially what you just described, is that if you are a farmer, whether it be in Peru or Brazil or Ethiopia, and you feel that your crops, the essential argument is if your life and your livelihoods are really threatened because of climate change, you would want to be able to sue and to be able to claim the costs that you are owed because your life has been affected so badly by climate change. Now that is an aspirational thing that has never come into being through the UNFCCC because understandably, rightly or wrongly, developed states don't want to set up a mechanism by which they have to suddenly pay out to all of these different people. They're scared because they don't want to have to pay out to any old farmer that comes up to them from their perspective. Now, there are a lot of developing countries who've been saying, this is just unfair. Our lives have changed dramatically, not through any fault of our own. And there's big debates within both the diplomatic community, but also you could read some of the climate justice and political philosophy literature around this. I'm sure Miriam's much closer to the ground in terms of where those discussions are going, though.
Maybe just a very quick word on that. That is a very practical example of dilemma that needs to be solved, and that's exactly the kind of dilemmas that we are not really looking at in the diplomatic community, because as you say, this is really just very scary. But having said that, I think one of the irony of the whole situation is that the discussions which are taking place on climate change and migration under the UNFCCC are under this kind of loss and damage agenda, which is essentially about, indeed, understanding loss and think of how you compensate this loss. But yet, despite the fact that this is the kind of chapeau, no one has the incentive to actually, say clearly and directly what do we do in cases where people should, as a moral notion, be compensated for things that they are not responsible for. So, as far as I can see, I don't think we are there in that discussion, and we are ready to have it. But since we were not ready to have any discussions around climate change and migration even a few years ago, doesn't mean that this will never happen. We have seen changes, so maybe that's a question that will come up in the next few years when there's a bit more maybe courage to tackle it.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. My name is Lu Jianzhang. I am from Beijing Peking University, China. Before I ask my question, I would like to add to answer for our Brazilian delegate just now. So thinking from a Chinese or Indian perspective, I believe there is no clear cut between saying that developed countries feel like they are in danger of being sued. In fact, I think, especially in China's case, we are also very worried about being forced to take upon this responsibility. But the thing that I am trying to enlighten on is that there should be some kind of rights to development for a nation. Like, I think it will be unfair to say, for instance, in the case of United States, United Kingdom, that after they have become developed, that it's necessary to ensure that China and India, during their developing process, cannot give off as much emissions as they had done, simply because climate change, of course, is threatening. But when you look at it, it does seem like unfair. So these developing countries, larger ones, then they are being forced to, let's say, if such a, this kind of mechanism, as you have mentioned, is put in place, then it does seem to be somewhat unfair, I feel, that they have to also pay the price for saying that they simply developed a bit later on than those developed countries. So my question is like this. I remember Dr. Holland is part of my English. Chazano had,
It's not your English, it's my name.
okay, thank you. Had mentioned that there's often the feeling that despite we all know the dangers of climate change, not enough has been done to combat it. But I think unlike some of the more far-fetched thinking, such as nuclear terrorism, climate change is something that we do know for certain is happening, and it's going to threaten our livelihoods no matter where we live on Earth. But then why is there this gap between government action and action against this very immense threat? I mean, we don't see like a lot of governments truly being positive to such a progress. So I'm just curious, what's your opinion on this? Thank you.
Anyone in particular you wanted to hear from?
No, I hope I can address the whole panel. Thank you all very much.
So the question is, why aren't countries doing more about climate change, essentially? Yeah?
Maybe I should restate it. It's like, so we all know it's a very important question. It's a very major issue, but countries are not doing enough to combat it. And why is this gap happening?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, I think, which a lot of people are hitting their head against brick walls about, because as you rightly note, climate science has been out there since the 1970s and 80s. There's a mix of answers. I think a big part of it is that our economies are so built on fossil fuels that it requires radical transformations. I mean, the fact that we're all sitting here in this room, I had to catch a flight from Italy, and I'm coming for a few days for a conference. Now, that's hardly, a great thing to do to the climate on a regular basis, but we assume, our society, you assume as, the organizers of this festival, that everyone can get on a plane and come here for a few days, and we can create an international conference, which is great, and I'm very happy to be here, and I'm delighted. But it's an assumption that we can do this, and you'll see in other jobs, whether they be, I'm sure, in the legal profession, throughout, we need to be able to move, or we think that we need to be able to move rapidly and quickly, and not only thinking about the cars and, our agriculture industries, which all create huge emissions. So shifting away from that does take a significant change to our economies and a significant change to the way we all live. And I think that's hard. That's hard on an individual level, and it's hard for governments to do. And it's particularly hard for governments to do that. Often there are strong vested interests, whether they be fossil fuel lobbies that are supporting and funding their campaigns, or employing people and giving jobs to people. It's very hard to say, no, we're going to shut down the coal mines in Australia, for instance, because thousands of people are going to lose jobs. So there are positive solutions. I don't want to paint a negative picture, and there are places, maybe I'll go back to my own country because I know it well, and we've had a change of government in the last year that we're trying to pass right now in New Zealand, a climate neutral act, which will mean that New Zealand won't have any climate emissions from 2050 onwards. And I know China as well has done a lot in recent years to try and cut their emissions. So there are countries that are trying to do it, but it's hard work.
Sure, I'll just jump in to say a couple of things just about the U.S. experience. I guess the first thing to say is that governments aren't monolithic, right? So you can have an administration that has a particular view of the science surrounding climate change, but you can have, in the United States, for example, the National Intelligence Council under the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which comes out with its global trends analysis for the next 5, 10, 15 years, which has highlighted climate change as a agency priority threat moving forward. At the same time, you'll have the Pentagon now has significant programs inside of its budgetary streams taking operational action to prepare for climate change in terms of how we think about basing, how we think about ships being, how they're going to refuel in certain places. So like those who have an immediate stake in the problem are already beginning to take action below some of the highest levels. And then also inside the United States, different cities have begun to mobilize. Those who are on the coasts have begun to take this up as a very serious agenda item and are now sort of leapfrogging over national government to participate in international fora around this problem. So I think you're seeing levels of mobilization. I mean, I think Nina's absolutely right. For all the reasons that she highlights, this is going to be an extremely difficult collective action problem, and all the traditional tensions of collective action apply. However, you are seeing at different levels of, at least inside the US government, action being taken to prepare for what is largely considered to be the inevitable in many cases.
Thank you very much.
Hello, my name's Sebastian Loretti from New York. I just wanted to thank you all for this wonderful discussion we're having. And my question is directed towards all the panelists. Obviously, today and yesterday, we've been talking a lot about the challenges we face today in regards to migration, and now with this panel in regards to climate change. And the United States, as being for the last 30 years, the world's only superpower and de facto world leader, obviously has immense responsibility. And I just wanted to ask each of you, where do you think US leadership in the last 20 or so years has failed in dealing with or preventing these challenges?
I'll quickly speak to what I know best. I think it's foresight. Some of these things are preventable. For whatever reason, they happen, right? Mm-hmm. The Congo is one example. Some of these things, a lot you can't, but some of these, the wars, the discrimination, certain targeting things, there are things that we are aware of. Question whether or not we should be meddling in other countries' affairs, but that's a completely different question. But you can preempt some of the things that then lead to some of the migration. Not a lot, but I think there are certain policies and there are certain diplomacy stance we can take that may prevent some of these things. That's why I think we deal with the backlash and we're reactive as opposed to proactive.
I could speak to a number of foreign policy issues, but I think I'm going to highlight one. In 1988, many world leaders thought that climate change was an issue. It was George Bush Sr., Margaret Thatcher both highlighted it as an issue. In fact, if I recall correctly, Bush Sr. at this point in time was running for office, and he pledged if he won, he would hold a climate change conference in the White House. Now imagine that. Imagine if the Republican Party had all said climate change is an issue. George Bush Sr. took it on. His son took it on. They stayed in the Kyoto Protocol. They championed it. They pushed hard. Be a different world today.
I guess I've already spoken a little bit about, we've touched on the climate issue in a bunch of different places, and where the failures of government have been, and the failures of politics have been over the last 10 years. With respect to, I will talk about what I know best, and this is more people who have been displaced by conflict. And it's very rare that the international community manages to effectively get ahead of the curve in terms of working on preventative diplomacy, to try to prevent, or then once violence breaks out, to contain the violence that leads to most of the displacement that we see in the world. So if you look at our refugees, most refugees in the world at this stage are coming from 5 or 6 source countries, many of which are have been the source of or the origin of extended conflict now for decades. And we're just not very good at stopping that stuff before it starts, or even once it starts, our containment exercises have not been particularly effective. And there's lots of reasons to go into that, but it's really the prevention and then trying to deal with conflict resolution where I think we've got the most work to do in terms of sharpening our toolkit.
Okay. That's it? All right. Thank you.
Just in the effort of time, I'm going to ask the next people asking questions to try to direct their questions at one particular panelist, just so that we can squeeze them all in. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Josh Clarkson, and I'm a sophomore here at Tufts, and my question is for Mr. Bomani. In your opening remarks, you talked about the changing philosophical climate that you were seeing in the United States, and I thought that was a really interesting idea and also a nice phrase to coin. And I was just wondering if you could speak to how you've seen the philosophical climate regarding migration change from when you first came to the United States versus now, and maybe where you see it going in the future?
Well, I think a date that I think most of you are already alive, but 9/11, I actually think to this day has changed a lot about how we think about migration, and it's not talked about anymore. We think of it as a remembrance day. But I think 9/11 fundamentally changed what the average American, and I'm not in politics, but the average politicians might look at migration and refugees and crises of that nature. Now, we have a focus where we think about Muslims and we talk about borders, but I think it all goes to security. I mean, you hear the same nomenclature, but I think 9/11 fundamentally changed. I mean, I came here before 9/11, came in 2000, and 9/11 happened. And I mean, we all can talk about how when we went to the airport, you could walk up to the gate, and then you could wave to the person. That's one aspect of it. But I think even when I came here, it was a arduous process. I mean, I was a refugee camp for a year, and the interviewer, the UNHCR people came, the DHS, I mean, it was a pretty arduous process. Every process has its flaws, but it was a good enough process. I think 9/11 changed that, and I think with time, I mean, we could talk about Brexit, we could talk about what's happening in our own country with our politics. I think what you're seeing fear. I really think there's a fear element that's percolated, and I really do think it's a perception, because I'm not sure that the data bear. There is a fear perception of otherness, and there's other things that, as Coke said, the jobs and everything else, but I think there's a fear element as to what a country is becoming. We don't know what it's becoming, and that's not an American problem. You hear the same conversation when you think about Brexit. What our country is becoming, I can't recognize it, I can't get a job. I think it's a fear element.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here and for discussing this really important topic. My question is, if you could speak about your understanding of the term environmental racism and, in targeting, the most vulnerable communities, how you see environmental racism in the context of climate change and migration. I'm thinking about like disaster relief and inequities. Dr. Hall, you talked about, Katrina and disaster efforts there. I'm thinking about pipeline construction, water quality, all of those kind of things in the context of climate change and migration. I didn't have a specific, but anyone could answer.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not one I've worked on actively, so here I'm sort of speaking off the cuff, and I think what you highlighted is an issue that often people who are affected by natural disasters and lose out, whether it be the example I gave in Hurricane Katrina, or also you could look in other contexts. They may be the poorer people in a community, so it may not be racism, it may be class-based, but there may also be a race element of it. One interesting example, and maybe this doesn't speak directly, but in the context of Burma, I know that there were some issues as well around humanitarian aid, and maybe Harden knows more about this as well, where you had a natural disaster hit, and because there's already predefined persecution happening against Rohingya specifically, as I understand, the Rohingya community and many others didn't receive assistance after Hurricane Nargis. So that was a very, very clear issue where people were being persecuted, but very distinctly, in a distinct way, because they couldn't get aid when they needed it. So there's all sorts of perverse ways that environmental racism could, I haven't used that term before in my work. I don't know if it's been applied actively in that context, but that's one example.
Thank you.
Hi, I have a question for Ms. Chazelle Noel. My name is Spencer Glendon. I'm a senior fellow at the Woods Hole Research Center, and I've previously been an economic historian and a director of finance in a large investment firm. And my work is collaborating with climate scientists to help illustrate what the future will actually be like. My answer in part to the young Chinese man is that one of the biggest failures is the failure of imagination. I think it's been very hard for anyone in the world to conceive of what the world will be like. It's easy ex post to say we should have known, but actually as somebody who was born in the 60s, I can tell you that even in the 80s, we had no idea, even if we cared about this topic, what it would mean. And so it's only now that people are starting to imagine. Most of my work is about that imagination. And so I have a question for you as it pertains to the COP conversations and related conversations, which is that I think that there's a different kind of causality that can happen, which is that if we start illustrating the ways migration is likely, it will lead to more action on mitigation, which is that we actually need people to start imagining what the benefits will be from mitigation, including the ideas of stability in the flows of people. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts about that, because I think that one of the strongest arguments for the developed world to act decisively actually is the fear of people moving globally quite aggressively and in a panic-stricken way. And we don't yet hear the term, what's called armed lifeboat diplomacy, but is the idea that people will be saving themselves with weapons and keeping people both out of their own lifeboats and shooting the other lifeboats. This is a topic that is now part of the political science of prospective climate change. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts about how you think now you can influence the negotiations, not to remind them that it's important, but to tell them why they should work harder on mitigation.
Thank you. That's such an interesting question. I think you're very right. I mean, I've been asking myself a few times, why is it that in the last few years there is more interest in this specific issue, which wasn't really interesting to most people? I mean, of course, you can pinpoint to different factors, but actually, maybe I'm a bit cynical, but I do also think that there's an interest because of this sense of threat that, oh my God, we need to do something to stop these people from migrating. At the same time, it can be an opportunity in the sense that both of the climate change negotiations and the migration negotiations, essentially, if we boiled it down to something very simple and maybe a bit too one-dimensional, but the primary goal of the policymakers is to keep people where they are. So in order to do so, what tools do they have at their disposal? So they have climate migration and climate mitigation and adaptation. Now you have to imagine that for most people who work in the migration policy world, they have no idea what this means. I have a vague understanding, but I would actually need someone. It's next to impossible for people to imagine what this means in practice. So that's why we go back to the question of bringing the communities of practices together, because it's one thing that you do have, let's say, some governments convinced that they want to avoid migration, so they want to do something about it, so they want to work on climate mitigation. But the people working on this migration dimension have no idea what it actually means. And that's why you need to be able to produce, it's not just data, it's really about this translating this, what seems like a very difficult concept into something that people like them, me, most of my colleagues can understand. So to go back to the second part of the question, which is about the climate negotiations and how you can bring this in. I mean, first of all, I think someone would need to start, do a bit of a background work to get this topic on the agenda. I mean, but for instance, since we were talking about the Task Force on Displacement, which is this working group working on these issues in the UNFCCC, they are going to meet very soon in April. I don't see why the IOM or other actors part of this task force would not be able to bring these questions to the attention. Now, after we don't control what the member states wants to do with it, but I guess one way to go about these things is to just get a kind of champion who would be like, okay, do you guys want to look at this? Do we want to discuss that? But then you would need to have people who would be able to really make sense of it in a way which is precise but accessible. Because to me, that's, I think, where there's one of the biggest difficulties is that it's hard to understand what migration is if you're a climate change specialist and vice versa, what all of these big words around climate change are if you're a migration specialist. So it's a matter of having someone who puts this on the table, then to get interest, political interest from states to do something about it, and then at the same time be able to explain very concretely what this is and what can be done.
Yeah, I'll just offer thank you, and I'll offer just as a suggestion. There is one source of precision in climate forecasts, and that's from the economic models, all of which preclude migration. Mm-hmm. In fact, all of the economic models that estimate the damages from climate change, all of them actually rule out any migration in order to make them soluble. Okay. And so you can offer a form of imprecision, which is to say, whatever your estimate is of how the world will change, it's way too low, mm-hmm. because all of those equations are solved on the premise that no one will leave. Mm-hmm. And so that's why the northern countries in Scandinavia do really well. Yeah. They all get rich, but nobody moves there. that's how those models work. And so it may be a way to aid the negotiation to point out the weakness of the economists. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I was just going to add a really quick statement on it, sorry. But I can talk, yeah, no, that's no problem. I can talk more about it. But just one thing to note, that a lot of migration experts have pushed quite strongly for migration not to be seen as a threat. So it's a real tension, and the environmentalists, and in fact in my research I look at this, like Friends of the Earth have all said, we should see, climate change is going to lead to migration and therefore countries will act. Like that exact language has been used. And actually over time, a lot of the NGOs like Greenpeace shifted away because the migrant community was like, we don't want to be seen as threats. We don't want to be seen as these people who are like hordes coming into Trafalgar Square. And actually Coco Warner pushed quite hardly to get migration seen as a positive adaptation strategy, to say actually people have always migrated, and that was included in the Cancun UNFCCC negotiations. So I think one of the troubles with that is I totally agree we need to get countries to act, we need to get countries to imagine. I share all of those same values with you. But then there's also this tension of, but we want to make sure that migrants aren't dehumanized in that process. So how do we do both? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Thomas. I'm a graduate student from France, and I had a question for you, Dr. Hall. If I understood well, your conclusions implied that the role of developed nations in helping countries like Pacific Islands dealing with climate refugees would be to mitigate climate change, to mitigate the effects of climate change. And I just wanted to know if you thought that Western nations, developed nations, and international organizations could also help building up the resilience of the countries, and in what way they could do that.
Sure, good question. So I think there are three things I tried to highlight. The top is mitigation, how to make sure that countries, whether it be the US or New Zealand or Australia or Denmark or wherever, cut their emissions. The second is helping the Pacific Islands and other countries adapt. So they are actually asking for more climate finance, and there's been a huge increase since about 2009 in Copenhagen, where there were pledges to have increased financing to help developing countries cope with the effects of climate change. To give you one concrete example, in New Zealand, the new government has established a Pacific Reset, where they're going to have about 150 million New Zealand dollars. I don't know, that's probably about 100 million US. The New Zealand dollar isn't that strong. To go to the Pacific Islands to help them deal with climate change. And then the third, which I think is important and has come up a bit here, is pathways to move, but to migrate. So a lot of the discussion in the task force as well is about mobility. It's not humanitarian refugee visas. It's saying Pacific Islanders have always moved within the Pacific context. And in fact, I think Samoa has now said people from Tuvalu and Kiribati can move visa-free. So the Pacific Islands are all separate countries, and unlike the EU, there's no Schengen state that you can easily shift from one country to other. It's just like if you are from Samoa or Kiribati, you have to apply for a visa. And some countries are trying to facilitate that now. And equally in New Zealand and Australia, there's discussions about increasing our Pacific Island categories so that more Pacific Islanders could come to move when they wanted to. So those are the three things, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth, and I have a question for Dr. Hall. So you mentioned listening to affected people and hearing what they want in implementing solutions, and specifically in New Zealand with the official changing the tactic from the climate visa to stopping emissions in New Zealand and funding help. So how are migration experts listening to affected people, and are there structures in place to include these narratives and these the reasons and the things that they need?
Great, and I'm sorry I'm taking all the questions, so if any of my co-panelists want to jump in. I think there are different ways. I think that international negotiations tend to be between different states. So if Pacific Islands, for instance, or African states have representation, and they do at the Global Compact, then their views should be being heard. One of the challenges for particularly small island states like the Pacific is they're tiny, most of them are less than 1 million people, so it costs a lot of money, and they don't necessarily have the capacity in the diplomatic corps to represent themselves at some of these big negotiations. So they rely and need assistance from other organizations to get their voice heard. But it's important to remember that these discussions we're talking about, the UNFCCC, the Global Compact, are intergovernmental, which means that all the Pacific Islanders, and Tuvalu, for instance, has been very vocal at the UNFCCC and saying very strongly, as have other Pacific Islands, that they want mitigation. More specifically on migration, I think a lot of migration decisions get made at a regional level. So, you know, the Pacific Island Forum, for instance, in the New Zealand, Australia, Pacific context is one place where Pacific Islanders will meet and they will discuss these sorts of issues. And they were the ones when I cited the Niue Declaration. So that was all the Pacific Island states, as well as New Zealand, Australia included in that. And I know that the Nansen Initiative and the Platform for Disaster Displacement had also highlighted that they have offices in the Horn of Africa, I believe, and also in Fiji, who are trying to develop best practice guidelines by listening to and having consultations. So a lot of these international mechanisms will also hire staff and make sure they have people in regions so that they can do exactly that. Whether it's effective or not is another question.
Maybe just to add that there are some formal, there are some, in all of these UN processes, you do have consultation process, like spaces where representatives of civil society who are supposed to be the link between the communities and the government. So there is a formal space for this, for these voices to be heard. In my experience, you do find, not everything that will be said by the civil society will be taken into account, because that would just be unrealistic. But I do think that they are able to influence the process to an extent that is probably higher than what you would imagine. And some of the things that we see in terms of language or issues that are taken into account in these global documents, they have been pushed by civil society and they have been listened to by the states. Not everything works out, obviously, but there is, even though these mechanisms are really imperfect, you do get the voice of the people represented to an extent. I'm not saying it's enough, but there's at least a bit of it.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Naria, and I'm here as part of Canadian delegation. And my question would be directed, I think, at Mr. Lang and Dr. Hall and all panel members who would like to speak about it. So my question is actually, the military has largely contributed to climate change. Can you please elaborate on how this is addressed by international community and what are the main challenges?
That's interesting. So I'm not an expert in terms of what the military has or has not done in terms of contributing to climate change. All I would say is that, at least in the United States, the Pentagon has very much taken this on board as an issue, right? In terms of they're facing the global climate change is going to change their force posture, their planning mechanism, their planning scenarios, all kinds of things. And they are doing certain things like trying to make bases in particular places less fossil fuel dependent. And so there are some efforts that are ongoing to try to lighten the carbon footprint of particularly the US military. But I'm not sure that it has taken this on, and I can't speak for them, but I'm not too sure that it's taken on this mantle with a sense of we were part of causing this. I mean, I think there's much more a sense of like this is a problem of industry writ large, and more a problem of we now need to deal with this and manage the fact that it's going to be part of reality. So if you want to, it would be helpful maybe if you could spell out a little bit more about the assumptions that undergird your question so we can speak more directly to them.
I think as part of my UPeace class, as a grad student at the University for Peace, I remember one former soldier talking about how tank produces like 100 times more GHG emissions than our conventional understanding of GHG emission producers. And so that's like, they are producing more GHG emissions, and what is being done in terms of climate mitigation to hold them accountable.
Sure. Well, the only thing before I'll turn the panel, I suspect that I probably used a lot more of my carbon credits, flying from Washington, D.C. To Boston So I think we're all guilty, right, on this process. And so I think now really, the effort is to look at what can be done in terms of taking very concrete steps in the way in which we all sort of function and operate moving forward.
I'm not an expert on this either, and I think I would just echo that I haven't seen any sectoral-wide research showing the impact of the military vis-a-vis other sectors. It's an interesting one to ask. It'd be interesting also to discuss with those who work in the military about the discussions happening. What I have seen and am aware of is very much a shift in the US Defense Department and seeing climate change as a security threat. Way back in 2010, it was already one of the #1 security threats. Now, and there are debates about how that's framed and whether or not the US, and I'm not abreast of these, whether the US military sees itself as being ready enough for climate change and what they're doing to adapt, both in bases and elsewhere. And I know that NATO as well, when I was at Copenhagen at the climate change negotiations in 2009, the head of NATO at that point was also saying climate change is a major security threat that we need to deal with. So I think in general, they're aware of it. In terms of mitigating, I know less about what actions are being taken to cut military emissions, and it's an interesting question. So yeah, I would pose it in the break to those who are here, who work in the armed services. I'd be really curious to hear.
Thank you.
So if there aren't any more questions, let's just give one more round of applause to the panelists. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
So we're taking a bit of a dinner break now, and we're going to reconvene at 6:30 for the keynote address from Minister Miroslav Lajcek. So I look forward to seeing you all then, and thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Gabe. Great work.
Thank you.
You did really well.